Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Selamat siang semuanya para hadirin yang sudah hadir di acara seminar hari ini ya.
Betul sekali. Ibu bapak gimana nih, udah selesai makan siang?
Sudah.
Ya, alhamdulillah ya. Lumayan ya kalau makan siang itu zat besi. Zatnya ke perut, besinya ke mata ya Pak ya Bu ya. Jadi agak set-set gitu. Apalagi sekarang kita akan menghadapi acara seminar. Mudah-mudahan ini seru banget karena ini narasumbernya keren-keren.
Luar
dan
biasa semua.
didatangkan langsung dari mana ya?
Dari Belanda dong.
Dari Belanda ya. Oke, kalau gitu masih banyak mungkin yang di luar-luar, silahkan untuk segera menempati tempat duduk yang telah disediakan.
Iya, betul sekali.
Karena sebentar lagi acara akan segera dimulai. Oke ya, karena sudah ada pesertanya, udah ada 3.500, kita langsung dimulai aja kali ya.
Iya betul.
Oke.
Yang pastinya tema hari ini akan mengambil judul Museum Decolonization and Repatriation ya, nanti yang akan dijabarkan lebih luas pada nanti oleh moderator dan narasumbernya ya Cinta.
Betul sekali. Kita di sini hanya sebentar ya.
Iya.
Hanya untuk membuka, karena kalau kita yang jadi moderator dan narasumber mungkin kacau.
Iya.
Oke.
Enggak lupa juga kita sapa-sapa dulu ya.
Harus dong.
Betul.
Karena mungkin sudah ada wajah-wajah baru nih, kalau bapak-bapak yang di depan sama ibu. Halo Pak, Ibu. Dari tadi mungkin udah bosan lihat kita ya. Kalau yang lain mungkin belum ketemu sama kita, boleh kita sapa-sapa dulu kali ya.
Iya betul Cinta. Ya, kita sapa dulu buat selamat datang buat Ketua Panitia Ibu Dahlia, selamat siang.
Halo Bu.
Ibu.
Berikutnya kepada Ketua Amida seluruh Indonesia, selamat siang dan selamat datang.
Kemudian juga ada para Kepala Dinas Budaya dan yang mewakili, selamat siang.
Selamat siang dan juga selamat datang dan selamat siang kepada para Kepala Museum. Sebelah mana Pak? Para Kepala Museum di sini? Oh,
ini wajah
Bapak.
baru ya.
Wajah-wajah baru yang baru bertemu kita ya Pak ya. Oke, berikutnya
ada penggiat dan komunitas museum, selamat siang.
selamat datang juga, dan juga ini kita mengucapkan selamat datang kepada para tamu dari para delegasi Belanda dan juga kepada narasumber dan moderator. Ya.
Iya juga kita sapa juga kepada Ibu Hasti Tarekat Dipo Wijoyo, selamat siang Ibu.
Halo Ibu, Ibu udah merekah banget pakai juping ya.
Iya,
Selamat
ceria
siang.
ya. Dan juga kepada Miss Yolanda Ezendam dari Rijksdienst Het Cultureel Erfgoed.
Halo. Berikutnya kepada
Bapak Ruben Smith dari Renwat.
halo. Dan berikutnya ini kepada Ibu Shaula Supit, Netherlands Embassy. Halo.
Halo Ibu.
Selamat siang untuk semuanya yang sudah hadir. Terima kasih yang sudah menyempatkan waktunya untuk hadir, dan terima kasih juga kita mengucapkan kepada Tuhan Yang Maha Esa kita masih diberikan kesehatan dan kesempatan untuk berkumpul ya pada siang hari ini.
Iya.
Oke, tidak lama lagi ini kita akan langsung
memulai acara ya.
Ya betul, memulai acara seminar, tapi seminar biasanya itu ada moderator.
Iya, betul.
Kali ini moderatornya saya aneh banget.
Kenapa?
Ini moderatornya kan kalau museum tuh biasanya udah yang berumurnya senior, bukan tua ya, senior. Nah, tapi ini masih muda.
Oh ya.
Masih muda.
Berarti
karena apa?
Luar biasa dong kalau gitu ya. Pengalamannya
Luar biasa.
lebih banyak ya.
Pengalamannya mungkin dia umurnya 40, pengalamannya udah 72.
Sama aja dong.
Bener ya. Ini masih muda banget, dan dia adalah salah satu peneliti arsitek di ITB. Betul ya, peneliti arsitektur di ITB, betul? Betul?
Betul.
Betul ya. Boleh kita langsung panggil aja mungkin ya. Ini moderator kita adalah Bapak Ahmad Zudi Alam STM HUM. Boleh tepuk tangan loh, biar agak semangat gitu siang hari
silakan.
ini. Tapi sebelumnya Pak, kayaknya nggak Bapak ya kalau ini ya. Kayaknya
Kakak aja ya.
Pak, boleh nggak kita chit-chat dulu, kita ngobrol dulu?
Iya, boleh diambil mic-nya sambil duduk juga nggak apa-apa.
Sambil duduk aja.
Iya.
Oke, kita ngobrol dulu sebentar ya sebelum kita serahkan acaranya semua ke moderator yang gaul ini yang keren. Gimana nih? Kesan aku mau nanya langsung ya, gimana kesan pertama akan ada seminarnya ini?
Tentang museum
Tentang
ini ya.
museum.
Mungkin ini
Mau
baru
diadain,
pertama kali.
ya ini kan acara Hari Museum Nasional Indonesia tahun 2022 setelah pandemi. Ada langsung acara seperti ini, gimana kesannya? Dapat saya jadi moderator di acara ini, gimana kesannya?
Ya, oh ya, mungkin sebenarnya perlu diketahui bahwa
Iya.
saya sebenarnya moderator pengganti karena yang seharusnya menjadi moderator telah berpulang seminggu yang lalu.
Oh, Bapak siapa tadi lupa?
Desmond.
Bapak Desmond, betul.
Jadi ya itu. Cuman untuk topik seminar kali ini sebenarnya penting terkait dekolonisasi dan repatriasi, apalagi kita mengajak teman-teman kita dari Belanda gitu ya. Dan repatriasi itu kan bahasa sederhananya pengembalian koleksi ke museum-museum di Indonesia gitu ya. Nah ini harusnya teman-teman museum nih yang tergabung di dalam Asosiasi Museum Indonesia mendengar dan menyaksikan, menyimak apa
Recording
yang akan
in
dibahas
progress.
oleh para pembicara sehingga bisa mempersiapkan diri dalam menampung koleksi-koleksi hasil repatriasi.
Iya, betul
Ya,
sekali
jadi,
ya. Banyak juga yang sudah di luar ya, betul ya Pak ya?
Iya, jadi ini kita harus mempersiapkan diri, jadi penting.
Sangat penting banget, dan ini temanya juga sangat luar biasa ya. Jadi jangan sampai ada yang terkantuk-kantuk. Harus semangat ya hari ini. Dan gimana nih persiapannya dong?
Mungkin nanti dikenalin deh langsung sama beliau ya, moderator-moderatornya ya.
Oke deh, kalau mau narasumber kali.
Iya. Iya betul, narasumbernya ya.
Oke, sudah siap, akan saya langsung kembalikan kepada, ini bilangnya kakak apa bapak sih jadinya? AA aja ya. Oke, kalau gitu kita langsung aja kita serahkan semua
kepada Kang Ahmad Zudi Alam.
Oke.
Waktu dan tempat kami persilahkan.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Silakan. Terima kasih.
Wah, terima kasih. Ini MC-nya saya jadi kikuk juga ya karena saya pikir acaranya serius banget, MC-nya membuat ini menjadi lebih ringan ya acara ini. Dan ya kita berterima kasih kepada MC yang sudah mengantarkan acara ini. Oke, karena kita juga sebenarnya sudah agak mundur ya waktunya, jadi saya tidak akan berlama-lama. Sesi seminar kali ini kita akan mengundang 5 pembicara. 5 pembicara ini mungkin kalau di rundown tadinya ada 3 di dalam satu sesi, kemudian 2 di sesi kedua, tapi kita akan gabung. Dan ini adalah seminar internasional, jadi saya mungkin akan berbicara juga dalam bahasa Inggris secara umum ya. Oke, our international seminar will be joined by 5 speakers. 3 of them are academicians, and the last 2 is practitioner or representing government ya. Let's just say that. We invite unfortunately one of the speaker cannot attend to Bandung, so she will join us through Zoom meeting, and I have seen that she has waiting in the Zoom. Okay, so the present for speaker is Dr. Gani Ajailani, Ajeng Aryani Kasih, Miss Ajeng Ariane Kasih, and Dr. Feneka Sisling, Ambassador Igusti Agung Wesaka Puja, and Dr. Sadiah Bonstra. Without further ado, I invite you all to the stage. Yeah. The first speaker is Dr. Gani Jailani. He is a lecturer in Department of History and Philology at Universitas Pajajaran with research focus in colonial history, science history, medical technology, and then colonial history formation and historiography. The second speaker is Ajeng Araini Kasih, PhD doctor candidate. She is a lecturer at University of Indonesia at Department of Archaeology at Museum specialization in museum studies. She also student at University Leiden. And the third speaker is Dr. Feneka Sisling. She is lecturer at the Institute for History, specializing in the history of science and colonialism. She has interest in natural history collection and their colonial roots. And the fourth speaker is Ambassador Puja, who is currently the executive director of ASEAN Institute for Peace and Reconciliation. Previously, he was ambassador, Indonesian ambassador to the Netherlands, ya Pak, and involved in some repatriation activities. And the last speaker is Miss Dr. Sadiah Bonstra, a historian and curator, obtained her PhD in history from Free Universiteit Amsterdam in 2014, and currently head of Transition Museum, head BLU MCB ya. Okay. So the first speaker, are you ready, Mr. Gani? As I have mentioned before, that the topic of decolonization and repatriation is like in the same coin. If we talk about museum collection, atau ini maybe I will speak also in bahasa, so our Indonesian attendees can can understand more. Jadi topik repatriasi dan dekolonisasi ini dalam museum adalah berada di dua sisi mata uang gitu ya, yang tidak bisa dipisahkan gitu loh, bahwa repatriasi itu adalah bagian dari dekolonisasi yang semangatnya makin kesini itu makin istilahnya harus makin digencarkan gitu ya. Tapi secara konten tentu teman-teman pembicara yang akan lebih mengerti. Pak Dr. Gani akan menjelaskan mengenai historiografi dekolonisasi dalam sejarah secara umum. Kemudian Mbak Ajeng akan menjelaskan mengenai dekolonisasi di museum ya Mbak ya, di museum dengan reframing Japanese occupation gitu. Mungkin langsung ke Dr. Jailani dulu kali ya. Siap, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Zudi, thank you. Good afternoon everybody. First of all, I would like to extend my thank you to the committee of this event to to Association Asosiasi Museum Indonesia for having me in this forum. So as mentioned by Zudi just now, my topic is about decolonizing Indonesian historiography. And I would like to begin my presentation by clarifying some term of colonization, because decolonization is a well-known term, although it's yeah. Okay. The general sense of the word refers to the practice of unmaking and departure in relation to the colonial experience. In other words, the word concern an attempt to restart an order after having the colonial experience, replacing the colonizer by the colonized. Although this political interpretation of decolonization is the most common, but it is not the only one. In a broader sense, decolonization is not only centered on political issue, but also includes social and institutional change that began to take place in the mid-20th century, starting from the issue of land ownership, urban symbolism, racial and class segregation, and so on. In this definition, decolonization is more an unmaking and departure experience that concern in a certain period, the transition period from colonial to post-colonial, which in the study of Boget and Raben took place between 1930 and 1970. On this occasion, I would rather talk about decolonization as a practice that not only change social and economic structures, but also the structure of knowledge. This because the practice of everyday life, the political and economic practices were generated from the structure of knowledge. In other words, to borrow Walter Mignolo's word, we must decolonize not only the content, but the term of conversation. So with this in mind, I will discuss the scientific structure of the historical discipline and the knowledge derived from it. The discussion on this matter will cover three aspects. First, historian practices in doing history, the knowledge produced from those practices, and lastly, the relation between the people and the time, on how an individual regards and interprets the time, the past, the present, and the future, or to use a French historian, François Hartog, they will change the structure of the regime of historicity. Regime d'historicité. I will begin by discussing the name of the discipline itself, sejarah. In the book titles Pengantar Ilmu Sejarah, Introduction to History, written by Kunto Wijoyo, the term history comes from the Arabic sajaratun, which means tree. The etymological understanding gives visual image of a discipline that entail a process of growth from seeds, roots, stem, twigs, leaves, and fruit. With this description, the study of history presupposes a process to understand the root of an event or problem, something that is no longer visible but exists and become the basis of the element that descend from it, such as stem and branches. Within this framework, the past and the present, like root and branches, constitute a single entity, a continuum. The past is not separated from the present, to be put in a place, to be separated from the present, which desire to understand more objectively. So the view of the past as a continuum, as well as genealogical, is most likely descended from Hinduism and Islamism tradition that are already quite rooted in Nusantara, as can be read in Babad, Hikayat, and Serat. Generally, these texts tell the origin of creation, a genealogy, to provide an explanation of current condition. Fact and fiction are mixed in it, and the reference of time is often vague. History is also included in the form of writing like that, as can be read in Sejarah Banten, in manuscript Sejarah Banten or Sejarah Melayu, there are no scientific principles that are operated today. The historical discipline practiced today come from the Western tradition, as we know, and operate in different way, whose root can be traced to the Greek period. As a discipline, it relies on knowledge that can be verified by observation. At first, the observation that had to be made directly, but in its development, the observation documented through text could also be used as sources of knowledge. Nevertheless, the historical discipline that operates today is something new. It was only formed in the 19th century in relation to the formation of the nation state. Thus, since the birth of history, history is closely related to the national history, giving historical justification for the nation state. To obtain very reliable knowledge, a number of verification procedures must be followed. This kind of criticism is often absent in local manuscript. But actually, the important criticism of historical scientific paradigm is the effect of the shift from sejarah to historia. Especially, the arising effects are related to how the past is seen, how the past is presented, and how the past is interpreted. In the Historia framework, the past is seen as something far away, something that must be presented for analysis. The present is thus separated from the past. Pierre Nora, French historian, emphasized that the dichotomy between the past and the present in a strict cut of time, as desired by positivist historian who wish to make history scientific, must be abandoned. The separation between the past and the present in a clear line result in the historian having to write down the completed event so that they can be analyzed in depth. The completed event means an event that in the past that has nothing to do with the present. This idea often makes history less actual to answer today's problems, because with such a frame of mind, historians seem to be just playing around with the past. This is also what makes us, in studying history, instead of looking at traces of the past in the present, we look at present to glorify the glories of the past. Therefore, Pierre Nora once again refers to it not to the historian of the past, but the historian of the present, historian who is not only grapped with the history of the past, but also the history of present. As a result, the production of historical knowledge that has been widely carried out since Indonesia's independence does not seem to make people learn from the past. Instead, history became a contested field for political rulers who want historical justification to maintain their power. In addition, the past is seen romantically, used as an escape from the value of the present. Accordingly, people become skeptical in historical knowledge, and those who study it are seen as a waste of time. Because it is grappling with the present, historical studies need to also focus on issues that have a direct impact on the present. The lieu de mémoire project initiated by Pierre Nora is a good example of historical knowledge can be more functional. Through the project, Nora examined important sites that have meaning in the social life of contemporary French society. Sites that are considered to be the pillar of the life of the nation, sites to make French society always have ties to the past. Through les lieux de mémoire, he also launched a number of criticism regarding how the phenomenon of memorialization has made people no longer able to distinguish between history and memory. The more discussion about this, I think, will be relevant to question the ontological status of the museum in Indonesia, but that will require a special occasion to discuss this subject, I guess. So meanwhile, the question that should be asked now is, assuming that the colonizing historiography is making the history functional to ensure the needs of to the society, what action should be carried out to make that happen? In the first place, we should put an end to the separation between the past and the present. By bringing up the historian practices in producing knowledge as a subject of conversation. This could begin by questioning the prejudices, the paradigm, and ideologies that operate in the practice of selecting sources and research subjects. In producing the knowledge, the historian could not escape from what Michel de Certeau called a social side, un lieu de social. That is to say, that the way historians work is influenced by the le non-dit, or the invisible structure, historical institution, and the present historians in the society. This intertwined aspect precondition what can and cannot become history. And by doing so, history becomes not just dealing with the past. For historians who live in the present, their position will be then questioned. Their conceptual choices will be interrogated. At that point, the historians' affiliation with what may be related to their present-day political economic interests will appear. In other words, decolonizing knowledge begins with interrogating the knowing subject, that is the historian practices. These what are absent in our contemporary historical discourse, assuming that the distance between the historian and their object are required to create an illusion of objective knowledge. The status of the knowledge produced by these practices accordingly became questionable. At this point, in relation to the knowledge produced, there is one thing that deserves attention for discussion: the question of sources. As a knowledge based on traces, historical sources are the entrance to historical knowledge. It is something important, but still lack a place in the historiographical debate. Regarding the issue of sources, the definition of historical sources and how to read them is something that needs to be updated. If effort to find potential new sources need to be made, so that the practice of writing history is no longer based solely on archive, especially government archives. Refreshing perspective regarding the sources may need to follow what Jacques Le Goff said when explaining the history of mentality, that in history of mentality, everything is a historical sources. The enrichment of historical sources is also needs to be supported by the practice of critical reading. With this framework, the most common reason is the difficulty of accessing resources can be overcome, especially in today's condition. With many digitization programs, sources are become more accessible. At this point, the practice of reading, it become a very important practice. So, one thing that also need attention, reading this source must go beyond the colonial dichotomy, such as West, East, colonial sources, local sources. On several occasions, I often got comment regarding the lack of use of local sources. I'm well aware, and that shortcoming is also more of an option, because I prefer to interrogate the colonial sources, read them critically, and place them in the context of colonial politics. By doing so, I will be able to see how colonial knowledge was formed, knowledge which has then used as the basis for the practice of domination, either directly or indirectly. As was done by Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg, who read the Inquisition documents to reveal marginalized popular culture, something which, according to him, can also be applied to reading colonial documents. The aim is not to reveal the dominant views, but how the dominant views are enforced, how the dominant views then become the basis for the practice of injustice. Moreover, through reading against the grains, we can also read clue from those who have never had a voice, just as Ginzburg present, which is through reading Inquisition documents. It is necessary to practice such detailed analytical reading, because decolonization is not the practice of replacing everything from Europe or the West with local ones. Instead of structure, they marginalize one group, which only benefit one group. it is all must be changed. The vision of social justice must always be put forward. In this occasion, I think it is important to mention Muhammad Ali as a historian who tries to decolonize historical knowledge. First, he used history as an item. It was in the 1950s. First, he used history as an attempt to criticize the structure of feudal society, which was still very dominant. And secondly, he tried to explain supernatural phenomena such as ghosts, by materializing and put them in the historical perspective by saying that ghosts were believed to be the early settlers who were pushed into the forest by arrival of immigrants who were now known as the ancestors of Indonesian people. For people who are still living in feudal value and also strongly influenced by belief in mysticism, these two things need to be done so that post-colonial society can be in accordance with what it aspires to. Unfortunately, Ali's writings are not widely discussed. He is forgotten in the pile of history and enter into the group of ideological historians who are considered less scientific. Yet what he did was a response to the needs of the time. So decolonization is not doing research based on the other people's agenda, nor changing only the actors such as Indonesian centrist agenda in 1950s. It is not a national history oriented. That is why I think it is important from what is important from decolonization is the political agenda of knowledge itself, formulating what needs to be done, historical knowledge that is progressive, emancipatory, in favor of marginalized and vulnerable people. It is not historical knowledge that perpetuates the unjust power. At this point, the idea or the agenda of repatriation effort must be made because it becomes the political agenda of our knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gani. Yeah, I want to some ideas from Dr. Gani ya in bahasa. Jadi Dr. Gani menjelaskan kenapa sejarah itu perlu didekolonisasi dan bagaimana cara mendekolonisasi sejarah gitu. Yang menurut Dr. Gani itu salah satu ada dua ya. Yang pertama adalah membongkar pemisahan antara masa lalu dan masa kini, kemudian memperluas wacana terkait dengan apa sih yang disebut dengan sumber-sumber sejarah begitu ya, sehingga masyarakat itu bisa lebih apa yang disebut dengan misalnya mencontohkan tadi Muhammad Ali itu pakai apa cerita rakyat kepercayaan rakyat gitu ya Mas ya, lingkungan. Bagaimana mengincorporate supernatural elements di dalam sejarah begitu. Dan kita juga sudah mulai source itu tidak perlu lagi kita lihat dikotomisasinya misalnya antara lokal dan barat gitu, itu tidak perlu. Jadi dekolonisasi itu bukan hanya perkara kita yang bekas dikoloni itu harus maju saja gitu ya, tapi juga harus istilahnya memandang secara lebih jernih kondisi yang ada gitu. Dan itu mungkin selama ini sejarawan Indonesia belum banyak yang sampai sana. Yeah, that is Dr. Gani presentation on decolonization in history and how it reflect in Indonesian historiography. Okay, the second speaker, Dr. Ajeng. Belum. Are you prepared? Yeah. She will present about reframing Japanese occupation in the museum. As far as I know, that is her PhD topic ya, Mbak Ajeng. And maybe if we have one common one common area is we either Indonesian and the Dutch or the Netherlands are oppressed by the Japanese, yeah, during that era, both of us. That is the similarity between Indonesian and the Dutch. So, would you like? Okay, I will give the stage.
Thank you. Maybe it is better for me to stand up because I'll be seeing my own presentations here. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me here. It was such an honor to present here. I will talk about reframing the Japanese occupations in museums. Okay. First of all, this is my part of my ongoing PhD research, and it was funded by the LPDP. It was two chapters of my PhD merged into one presentations today. So, actually, my research is about decolonizations in museums in Indonesia, on how Dutch colonial era museums were decolonized in the present day. But in 2017, early 2018, when I was still in the Netherlands and looking for my data, I went to an exhibition in Brussels. It was titled Power and Other Things. And there, I was encountered with the works of Antariksa, the art installations. Antariksa is a historian and visual artist, and he is his works is most about Japanese occupations. And at that time, I think that it is something I rarely encountered in museums in Indonesia. I never really understand the Japanese era as he is presenting in his work. So I think I should put it inside my works as well. So I'm researching the Japanese occupations, and so here is my questions. So today I will talk about how was the development of museums in Indonesia during Japanese occupations, and how the era is presented in post-independent Indonesians throughout different political reigns, and why should we reframe it? Next. Before we start, I have a statement that museum is not neutral. It is consciously or unconsciously is entangled with political reigns, whether we realize it or not. So, how's the museums during the Japanese occupations? Most of us understand that during the Japanese occupations, the museums are not working. It stops. There's no managing the museum. It was stopped. The Japanese never built any museums in Indonesia. But actually, when I read the Japanese era newspapers, particularly in Java, because I can't find any other newspapers outside Java, so this data is for museums, colonial era museums in Java. The museum were open and run as usual. It continued the concept of a tool of empire by the Europeans. So back then, during the Dutch colonial era, museums were seen as a tool of empire to showing their colonies, their greatness of the empire. So the Japanese put the concept itself in Indonesian museums, because when Japan first colonized Taiwan and Korea, they built museums like European ones. But when they came to Southeast Asia, it was already World War II. They don't have time to build museum from the beginning, but there's already many museums established in the archipelago. So they use the old museums to put it as their tool of Japanese empire, and they put it as a war propaganda. So the the Dutch names was changed into Indonesian names and labels, like the Zoologist Museum become Museum Hewan, the Old Batavia Museum, Museum Sejarah Jakarta Lama. It was during the Japanese occupation. And in some museums, like in Sono Budoyo in Jogja and Radia Pustaka in Solo, before the ticket price is divided by the social class, the Europeans, the Timur Asing, apa kita bilang? Far East, and the Inlander, the local people. But during the Japanese occupation, the Japanese really promoted that we are equal, so the ticket price is the same for everyone. It was different between adult and children, not because of the races anymore. And they employed Indonesians, of course, supervised by the Japanese, and the Germans is still free to work at the museums back then, like von Faber in Surabaya, but other Dutch was interned in camps. So also, Japan also built new museums in Indonesia. This is something we never know before. And the museum is here in Bandung, located at Villa Isola. It was called Museum Peringatan Perang di Jawa, established in 1943. It was about the victory of Japan towards the Netherlands. So they put, even like vehicles, war vehicles, plane was that was crashed, and so on. Also, the Japanese also established the Kalijati Historic House Museum in Subang, the place where the Dutch surrendered to the Japanese. In Indonesian museum books, it was stated that this museum was inaugurated in 1980s. But actually, when we delve into the newspapers of Japanese era, it's already there since 1943. Next. So, from the Japanese era, I jump into the New Order, not because of I don't want to talk about the Sukarno period, but during the guided democracy, there were no museums established by the central government. Sukarno himself didn't establish museums related to the Japanese, so I moved toward the New Order. So as we know, the New Order historiography was official, top-down, military history. So how's the exhibitions about the Japanese occupation in this period? In the Museum Monumen Nasional in Jakarta, one diorama is dedicated for the Japanese occupation era out of about 55 dioramas, and it is about the Romusa. So the New Order is highlighting the oppressions of the people through Romusa. And also, Peta. Peta is highlighted at that time. Also, Suharto's role in Battle of Kota Baru in Yogyakarta when dismantling the Japanese weapons. And also, Supriyadi as the symbol of Peta resistance against the Japanese. So, and also Peta as the embryo of Indonesian National Army. So the Peta is something really we understand a lot in Japanese occupations in history, Indonesian history. Next. While the other side of the stories, like the internment of the Europeans and Indo-Europeans in camps, are never told. Even in the Fort Frederick museums, the fort became internment camp during the occupation, during the Japanese occupations. But the museum in the 1980s was transformed into resistance museums, and there's no stories about them, about the Dutch who were interned. Also, some stories appeared in their recent publications, but not in their permanent exhibitions. Of course, the stories are available in the Netherlands museums. in some of the Netherlands museums. So they are memorizing their memories there, like you said, that's something we have in common, oppressing by the Japanese. It's in the museums. Next. The Museum Seni Rupa and Keramik, Jakarta. During the Suharto reign, the New Order, there is no stories about Japanese occupations in their chronology. Although they have Hengantung's sketsa of peta soldiers. Why the Japanese occupation period is important? Because when in Dutch colonial era, art and designs and visual arts is something exclusive, elite. It's for a higher class only. Not everyone can access. But during the Japanese occupations, the Japanese promoted it for everyone. So they send artists from Japan to Indonesians to teach Indonesians. They promote free studios, free paintings, free canvases, held exhibitions, art awards. So the Indonesian just realized that art and design can be used for nationalist propaganda, for independence propaganda, and it's continued to the next period. But it was downplayed by the New Order. And it's not only the art, but also other stories such as the massacre of the Chinese or uprising by the Kiais, anything that is not suit the historiography of the New Order. So during the New Order, Japanese occupation is downplayed, highlighting the role of the PETA, showing the hardship of the Romusa, missing stories of others, and of course the comfort woman is missing. Because in Indonesia we are very taboo to talk about sex and sexual violence, so there's no stories about comfort woman at all. And the Japanese occupation is only seen as a prelude to the next chapter of history, the revolutions. So what about the next, after the New Order was no longer in power? There is no policy on how the Japanese occupation narrative is supposed to be told during now, from post 1998 to the present day. Although there was museum revitalization since the 2010 to the present day, or at least to 2019. So how it is showing in the current museums? In some newly established museum post New Order, that the museum that was newly established, usually the Japanese occupation start to appear, but it is partly due to their the theme of the museums. For instance, like in Museum Pendidikan Dr. Surabaya, in Universitas Erlangga, there is stories about the history of the institutions during the Japanese occupations. And next. And also in Museum Bank Indonesia, there is the stories of the Indonesian monetary during Japanese occupations. Also, I think the money at that time also is a political propaganda for the Japanese. And next. But some stories are still missing. Some museums, for example, the Karma Wibangga Museum in Borobudur, Magelang. At that time in Borobudur, there are hidden foot of Borobudur on display. There was the relief for about 3 or 4 relief were excavated during the Japanese occupations, but it never mentions in the museums of Borobudur. Although the stories of the excavation during the Dutch colonial era is presented in the museum, so the Japanese era seems forgotten. For the case of provincial museums, not much provincial museum presented the Japanese occupation era. The best I can see from many museums is the Museum Balaputra Dewa in Palembang, one display out of the very big museums about South Sumatra. And even in Jakarta, the Japanese occupation is only by these collections. And when I asked the museums about why they didn't put Japanese occupation, they said we don't have much collections about that. So the reason is always there's no much collections or not much archives, so they didn't show the era. Even in Bandung, in Museum Kota Bandung, I visited them yesterday. It is this peta Jawa Hokokai and the perang, the war, the battles. One battle about Japanese. That's the all three event mentioned in the history of the city of Bandung. So it is also only the prelude to the history of the next chapter of revolutions. Still, although since 2018 there were temporary exhibitions started to appear, like the Jagung Berbunga di Antara Bedil and Sakura exhibit in Perpustakaan Nasional. It tells the stories of the role of the art propaganda during the war. So the story that are missing in Museum Seni Rupa and Keramik was told here. But it is only a temporary exhibitions. And the most recent one is Sakura di Katulistiwa. It was held by the Museum Perumusan Naskah Proklamasi in Jakarta. The museum itself was a former house of Laksamana Maeda, but not until their revitalizations in 2015 or something that the name of Maeda was included. Because the Indonesian government didn't want people think that the independence was given by the Japanese. That's why the name of Maeda was never mentioned in the museum in his house. So it is only recently his name is appeared, and only recently there is exhibitions about the encounter of the Japanese. And I think this is quite a great exhibitions because it is a controversial and untold history. It started with the Ronin, the Japanese samurai hired by the VOC in Banda Massacre, and then continue with the Japanese prostitutes in colonial era, Japanese spies during colonial era, to the propaganda, and finishing with these Japanese soldiers who were refused to come back to Japan and fighting the allies with Indonesians. So it's something untold, controversial history started to appear. And there is also new museums established, the Museum Perang Dunia II in Morotai. But this museum is about the war between the Japanese and the Allies. There's no stories about the Indonesians, so our stories is missing. Next. So in post new order, because there's no policy, so there's varied things about Japanese narrative that it started appeared partially, or it is also still hard to alter the new order's narrative, so it is still missing, or with the excuse of lack of collections and lack of archive. And the most important thing is there is no personal and social history. Next. In Singapore, I think in 1990s they started to think that Singaporeans didn't understand their history, so they put the policy on making the war as their history, their past history, historical past. But they don't want to tell the history between the war between the Japanese and the Allies. It's not their history. So they put the social and personal stories in the museum. They conduct oral interviews or oral history interviews, and they put it in the museum. So if you come to Singapore, there is about 5 or 6 museums in this very small country telling the story of the Japanese occupations. And it's all the social history, telling the multiple perspective, not only for the British POW, but also from the Japanese point of view, and local civilians. The local civilians is also divided into the Melayu, the Indians, and the Chinese. What happened to them? So we can't say that we don't have things like that. In 2019, I helped my friend Arjuna Kandoti and Maria Lamslang to hold exhibitions in Museum Sofiahof in Den Haag. And we are looking for stories about Japanese occupation, and I found within my extended families, I found 2 interesting stories. One story from my mother cousin, Pak De Baskoro. He said that his father was a double agent, was a spy during the Japanese occupation, and was murdered by the Japanese. And the other story from my other side, my mother's other side, cousins from the other side, there is a story of Eyang Anit. I used to call her Eyang Anit, but she was passed away. So I talked with the daughter, Eyang Retno, and she said that my mother used to be the daughter of a Wedana in Jawa Timur, and she was taught Japanese by the Japanese, and she have to teach the people Japanese language, and she is safe, but not taken as sex slave because she is the higher class of the society. But she have another task. So stories like that still exist, but the people I ask is already 70 years old and above. So that is why that is the reason why it is important we have to reframe the narrative before the people, the post generation memories are totally disappeared. So history is not only seeing from above, but also how it happened, why we understand it from the bottom to the top. So it is time. I think it is time for us not only to tell the stories from the perspective of only official, but also how people really faced the era. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Ajeng. Ya, jadi Mbak Ajeng ini menceritakan mengenai museum di zaman Jepang, ketika di museum di Indonesia ya, ketika zaman Jepang, dan bagaimana okupansi Jepang itu atau masa penjajah pendudukan Jepang itu dinarasikan dalam museum gitu ya. Secara umum sih setelah Orde Baru yang menjadi lebih banyak nyambung ke peta gitu ya, mungkin karena ada pesan Orde Baru, militarisasinya ya, militerisasi Orde Baru, dan sampai sekarang ternyata masih ada dampaknya ya Mbak, di mana Japanese occupation di dalam museum itu masih relatif hilang ketimbang misalnya di Singapura atau di Belanda atau mungkin di Eropa lain gitu ya, yang di Asia yang sepertinya lebih banyak cerita gitu. Kalau di Indonesia museum-museum kita hanya seadanya menampilkan kependudukan Jepang itu, dan yang lebih penting sebenarnya kalau Mbak Ajeng tadi cerita masih bisa kita mencari cerita tentang Japanese occupation, karena apalagi kalau kita menggunakan oral history atau personal dan social history. Itu mungkin yang diceritakan oleh Mbak Ajeng ya. I think I don't have to present in English again ya about what Miss Ajeng presenting. But the third speaker is Dr. Venneke, Dr. Sisling. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Can you hear me
Hello.
too?
Okay, sorry, we cannot hear you. Technical glitch. Wait a moment. You can try to speak, Dr.
Can
Sisling.
you hear me now?
Okay, now we can hear you.
All right. Thank you very much for having me here. My talk is about the collection of Indonesian natural history in the Netherlands. There is one big natural history museum in the Netherlands, Naturalis, in the city of Leiden. I was there yesterday with my students, and every time I am surprised by the numbers of objects from Indonesia that they have. In fact, I think the majority of their collection are from the former colonies of the Netherlands. For example, the Van Groenendaal collection is a butterfly collection made by a Dutch medical doctor on the island of Flores. In total, this collection numbers 500,000 butterflies, 500,000 butterflies. Of course, this doctor never collected these butterflies on his own. He had the help of a lot of locals who caught butterflies for him or who sent butterflies from other islands. This was in the 1930s. And all these butterflies are now slowly being digitized, so they will become available online. Besides butterflies, the museum also has lots of insects, plants, stuffed animals, a collection of economically valuable plants from Indonesia, such as spices and tobacco and rubber, and they have fossils. Indonesia does not have a lot of dinosaur bones, as far as I know, but they have something perhaps more important, fossils of early man, of our ancestor, the Homo erectus. And in particular, the Naturalis Museum owns Java man, the first of such specimens that was ever found, and I'll say more about that later. So these objects come from what is now Indonesia, but they're different from some of the other museum objects that are usually central to repatriation discussions. They are not objects that have been owned by anyone before. They are not war booty. They're not confiscated objects from subjected people. They're not trophies from moments of colonial violence. They come from nature. So they haven't really been owned before, except that, of course, they were part of someone's land. However, of course, this does not mean that they should be left outside discussions about decolonization and repatriation. I think that there are several topics that we should start discussing when it comes to natural history museums, and that's these four topics. First of all, colonial collecting, the history of colonial collecting. Second, the export of resources from Indonesia. Third, the othering of non-European nature. And lastly, the depoliticization of nature. And I'll say more about these four topics in the following. First, colonial collecting. The story of collecting. If the history of the Natural History Museum is told, it is still too often a history of male heroes traveling to unknown regions, overcoming hardship, and coming back with huge collections. This kind of stories should be turned around and told from below, with attention to the local people who helped European collector, who did all the digging and the shooting of animals, etc. as you can see here on this image. These are the porters and fossil finders that worked for paleontologist Eugène Dubois as he searched for fossils in Java. So the role of these assistants and intermediaries is usually omitted or underplayed. At the same time, in histories of exploration, several tropes or themes are also still often repeated, such as stories about silly locals who drank the alcohol from the jars in which the animals were stored, or who dried plants too close to the fire, so whole collections of dried plants were lost. But these are repeated so often that they really become a way to orientalize local people and to suggest that they knew nothing of science. But these stories about colonial collecting should be changed. Second, the story of the export of resources, or the story of the appropriation and bioprospecting. So because of these explorations and collections, the Dutch were able to advance their scientific apparatus, their institutions. They had work to do for decades with all the objects that they took from Indonesia. And of course, pure knowledge, pure scientific knowledge was not the one and only thing they were after. The Dutch also studied nature to identify and then to export resources, from spices to rubber to medicine. For example, the Dutch studied the so-called Strophanthus plant species, a poisonous plant. By the close of the 19th century, the British had created a new heart medicine from this plant, from the seeds of this plant, and the trade in these seeds was very, very lucrative. So the Dutch wanted to tap into this trade too. Eventually, it turned out that the active substance of the Indonesian species could not easily be harvested, so it came to nothing. But it just shows that these plants were collected to make scientific progress, but also profit. And after Indonesian independence, Indonesia had to catch up with all this scientific progress without having these large collections, because they were in the Netherlands. A third thing that I think merits attention when we look at natural history museums, and that was the way the nature from outside Europe was described. And that was often different from how European nature was described. Of course, in early modern times, there was very little knowledge in Europe of animals or plants outside Europe and how they really looked like and how they behaved. So some of the stuffed animals that the Natural History Museum in Leiden has from this period really look a bit weird, and they do not really give us an accurate picture of the animals. The platypus in this picture. The platypus in this picture, for example, was definitely not as fat as this stuffed animal makes it seem. So curator Jack Ashby makes the argument for Australia that its nature and especially its marsupials were always seen as weird and bizarre and evolutionary impossible, and that this kind of writing is still present in scientific writing and popular science writing about Australian nature. So this is an example of the othering or orientalizing of non-European nature. And as Indonesian nature is also partly Australasian, I think this is an interesting avenue to follow. I didn't find as good an example from Indonesia as this platypus, but I hope to in the future. So the fourth thing I want to mention is that natural history museums have successfully depoliticized colonial objects by insisting on a difference between cultural objects and objects from nature. Coming back from expeditions, cultural objects would usually go to ethnological museums. Natural history objects would go into the Natural History Museum. This also led to a narrative that these objects, the natural objects, had nothing to do with Indonesian people anymore, and this meant that these collections have long escaped post-colonial and decolonial discussions. But especially objects such as Java Man show that these objects are not only natural objects, but that they have a cultural history too, and that they're considered important as cultural objects and not only as scientific objects. And I'll say a little bit more about Java Man. So Java Man is the famous Homo erectus fossil, and it's now at the Naturalis Museum in Leiden. You can see it consists of a skull cap that you can see from two sides here, a molar and a thigh bone. And it was excavated in Indonesia in 1891 and 92. The story of Java Man is closely connected to that of Eugène Dubois, who went to Indonesia to find fossils. But as I said earlier, it was a lot of Indonesians helped him to do that, especially forced laborers who did most of the digging to search for the fossils. When Eugène Dubois returned to the Netherlands from his visit, he took the Java Man fossils with him as his personal possession. And it was...
Oké, ik heb dit op het web gevonden voor u,
sorry. It was only after 1945 that the Netherlands was reminded of the scientific and cultural value of these fossils in Indonesia, because after 1949, Indonesian politician Muhammad Yamin demanded the restitution of several Indonesian objects who were then in Dutch hands, and one of these objects were the fossils of Java Men. And as my colleague Caroline Drienhuizen and myself describe in a paper, Java Men was particularly important in the new nationalistic narrative that Yamin had formulated for Indonesia. Yamin tried to shake off the colonial historical narrative and formulated a new story in which the influence of colonial rule was minimalized and pre-colonial domestic strength was emphasized. So Java Man could show in this narrative that Indonesians had a very long lineage and that Java was one of the oldest inhabited places in the world. The Dutch were not at all interested in thinking about returning these fossils, and then when the discussion continued in the 1970s, the director of the Natural History Museum reacted very strongly. He said that these fossils had nothing to do with the Dutch colonial past, and that they should not be discussed with emotional and nationalistic argument, but only with detached scientific interest. Emotional arguments, he argued, were valid for ethnographical objects, but not for fossils. in fact, of course, he was himself pretty emotional about this issue. And his argument was a very protective and Eurocentric argument. But more importantly, for what I want to emphasize now, is that the director in this instance successfully separated nature from culture. And because that division between nature and culture was also institutionalized in museums, ethnographic museums on the one hand, and natural history museums on the other hand, the director has actually been very successful in keeping the natural history outside discussions about repatriation until today. So, I think the natural history museums in general, but the Natural History Museum in Leiden in particular still has a long way to go to realize that they are actually part of a colonial history, and that they should pay more attention to the different ways of decolonizing their histories. And coming back to the 4 points that or the 4 themes that I talked about, I think the museum should pay more attention to the role of Indonesians in the making of collections, to the role of natural history in colonial resource extraction, to the colonial ways in which nature was and still is described, and to the fact that natural history objects can have a cultural and historical value too. Thank you very much. I hope that this discussion will be continued.
Dr. Sisling menjelaskan mengenai Dr. Sisling menjelaskan mengenai yang tadi sempat dijelaskan bahwa Dr. Sisling adalah ahli dibilang mempunyai minat terhadap koleksi alam gitu ya di museum. Kemudian presentasi beliau memaparkan gitu loh bahwa sebenarnya selama ini objek repatriasi adalah yang selama ini kita fokus adalah objek etnografi gitu ya, objek budaya. Tetapi Dr. Sisling berargue that nggak cuman not only ethnography that we should repatriate or to decolonize gitu loh. Itu termasuk juga natural object. Bagaimana misalnya tadi tanaman, kemudian staf animal, kemudian mungkin yang kasus paling cukup signifikan adalah Java Man fosil yang sekarang masih ada di Belanda gitu. Yang itu menunjukkan sebenarnya kawasan Indonesia ini sudah dihuni sejak lama oleh orang ataupun makhluk ini ya manusia purba begitu. Oke, kita sudah melihat bahwa dekolonisasi. Jadi kalau tema our three first speaker, Dr. Gani, Miss Ajeng, and Dr. Sisling is speaking about decolonization and how it related to the museum. And it's not only about decolonization, it's not only about apa ya sih bahasanya itu, it should touch the structure of knowledge, and also and how museum as a collection which has collection is important in creating a more accessible historical source, or in the case of Dr. Sisling is a knowledge source that should be decolonized. The other two speaker will talk more about repatriation. Isn't it? Okay. Oh, that's not okay. So Ambassador Puja, the time is yours.
Thank you so much. Terima kasih. Mungkin suara mendengung yang di belakang bisa dimatiin ya di komputer. Agak mengganggu jadinya. Oke, terima kasih. Well, sitting on the podium here actually I have one good advantage, because I can observe you on the floor sitting, actually trying to struggling with your attention, and one in common actually, there is no coordination. You know what I mean? There is no coordination between your brain, your eyes, and your ears, because your brain asks your ears to listen, but your eyes did not listen your your brain. That sometimes that's why I saw very interesting faces while you're trying to hard to listen, but your eyes couldn't really keep up with focusing on our presentation. But it's a very natural, very normal, because we are all a human being. Anyway, talking about museums, decolonizations, and repatriations, this actually reminding me with a movie. The title of this movie is Kung Fu Panda. I don't know whether you saw this movie. This is about the past, the present, and the future. Of course, what we are talking now actually is about the past, the present, and the future. So in this movie, Kung Fu Panda, it is said that yesterday was history, tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift. That's why it's called present. Actually, I feel my presence today is really a present, because this is the opportunity for me to share with you in this very historical building, Gedung Sate in Bandung. On my position now as a chairman of the committee of the repatriations of Indonesian objects in the Netherlands, there is no relation whatsoever with my capacity in ASEAN, as you mentioned. But something really I wish to share with you what we are doing so far. But where I do begin? Well, I see this is something that we foresee and we look at the momentum. So next slide, next slide, please. Yes, no, the momentum. Yes, this is the momentum. As it is said that building momentum, excitement must lead to immediate actions, or you will lose the power of momentum. More dreams die because we fail to seize the momentum. Well, dear friends, colleagues, there is no need to reinvent the wheel in this respect. The momentum actually is there, around the corner. What we need is to build the momentum into immediate action. I will share with you what actually the momentums are. Well, you know, the repatriations of colonial objects recently has been high on the agenda of many countries, in particular in Europe. The debate is linked to a broader movement aimed at restorative justice. Early this month, the first week of October actually, if you follow the news, Cambodian team hunting looted treasures visited United Kingdom's museum. Cambodia wants the United Kingdom to help recover antiques were stolen from its sacred temples during the years of conflict. And the Cambodian team has marked some successes in other countries recently, with significant return of statues from the United States, for example. And the Cambodians said on the success that this return is like returning the souls of our culture back to our people. This reminds me of the Royal Way by André Malraux, the French author, which about an adventures among the lost temples in Cambodia. And if you recall also, the friends, in 2016, the French President Emmanuel Macron took an important policy to return objects to Africa from France within 5 years. And in 2018, President Macron commissioned a report on the return of African cultural heritage in the French collections, which recommended that objects which had been removed without permissions from their country of origin and sent to the French mainland should be returned if requested by the country of origin. Such restitution should be also accompanied by cooperations in research, scientific exchange, and education. And in addition to those projects, Belgium has also returned large number of cultural objects to Congo, and Germany returned large number of objects to Nigeria and Benin. If you recall also, in September 2013, the Netherlands handed over 4 ecclesiastical icons to Cyprus, which belong to the Church of Christ Antiponitis. It was actually the first time the Netherlands returned cultural property under the first protocol to the Hague Conventions of 1954. It also appeared to be the first time a cultural property was returned under this protocol in the world. It is considered that cooperations between states in order to preserve cultural property in their context and origin setting is of paramount importance, and the repatriations of these 4 icons to Cyprus is an emblematic examples of these cooperations. It is interesting to observe that the transfer of the icons highlighted questions such as, why has the international community made all these efforts? Why should these icons be returned? Why do we think this is so important? The answer is that cultural goods are connected to a country, to people, to their history. That's, as I said, the momentum that we have to make the advantage in the future. So now, please to the next slide. How we try to build in trust in this respect. Well, Pagani mentions about Carlo Ginzburg in his presentations. Italian historians, he traces the emergence of an epistemological paradigm which he calls the evidential paradigm, or the conjectural paradigm, which observed a shift in how knowledge was procured and in turn deemed reliable. So we start from this paradigm, then how we then comes to the next policy of repatriations. Then, as you saw and you follow this recent debate, that the Ginsburg paradigm has inspired actually the reports in the clues, research into provenance, history, and signification of cultural objects and collections acquired in colonial situations. The clues report covers diverse objects in the collections of the National Museum of World Culture and the Reich Museums. The report actually does not just provide an overview of successive ownership transactions, but also gives an insight into the concrete impact of large histories, such as how communities changed under the influence of imperialisms and colonial violence, the development of colonial knowledge productions, processes of museumizations, and heritage formation. And in particular, dear colleagues, as stated also in the report, priority is given to the cultural objects from the former Dutch colonies which are suspected to have been looted in the past and will be given priority in the process. So it has been acknowledged actually in the report that, I quote, colonial history has left traces in the Dutch society right up to the present. Over the course of time, many cultural heritage objects were removed from previously colonized regions and ended up in Dutch museum. Working constructively with countries of origin is essential to deal carefully with collections with a colonial background. And working together is a big step towards remedying historic injustice and offers fresh prospect for future relations with countries of origins. And only by making optimal use of the available knowledge and expertise in the Netherlands and the countries of origins, and working to strengthen collaboration in this field, can we arrive at the just approach to objects with a colonial background. I think this is affirmation from and the position of the Dutch governments. You know, the collections from Indonesia and the national museums of world cultures are huge indeed. There are hundreds of thousands of objects, and by far the majority is collected in colonial times. So let us make a flashback. So next slide, please. The issue of repatriations of Indonesian objects does not come out of blue. Dr. Sisling just mentions a little bit on this. I think Ibu Saida will also probably mention something later on. This is actually started at the Dutch-Indonesian Roundtable Conference 1949, in which the draft culture agreement provided a clear framework for the transfer of cultural objects, although actually no further action was taken. But I believe Ibu Saida has a different story on this, based on her new findings. Second, the visit of Muhammad Yamin to the Netherlands in 1954, explored the repatriation of the cultural objects. Dr. Sisling mentions about the Java Man, about the Dubois collections. In 1968, the cultural agreement resulted in series of transfer between 1970 to 1978 from Nagara Kartagama manuscripts in 1970. And if you recall also in 1975, the joint recommendations concerning cultural cooperations in the field of museums and archives, including transfer of objects. Indonesian delegation was led by Professor Dr. Ida Bagus Mantra, and the Dutch delegation was led by Dr. Robert Hotk. The objects returned, among others, a Prajna Paramita statue in 1978, now in the National Museums, Crown of Lombok, 242 treasures, and some objects belong to Diponegoro, taken from Brownback Museum. And also the return of 185 wayang by the World Museum Rotterdam to the Wayang Museum in Jakarta in 2005. And also the transfer of 55 ethnographic items from the Tropen Museums and the Tilburg Monastery of the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin in 2008 and 2009 to regional museums in West Kalimantan and Nias. And quite fresh actually, the transfer of 1,500 collections from the Nusantara Museums in Delft in December 2019. Pak Dirjen Hilmar Farid involved personally on this also. And symbolically, this transfers was actually marked by the visit of Prime Minister Mark Rutte in 2016 when he handed over the Bugis Keris to President Jokowi at Merdeka Palace in Jakarta. And of course, the last one, about 2 years ago, the repatriations in March 2020 of Keris Nagasiluman of Prince Diponegoro prior to the visit of King William Alexander to Indonesia. If you are curious who brought this Keris Diponegoro back to Indonesia, ask Ibu Saida, she knows. So, how we see this as a way forward, dear colleagues? Well, from the Dutch perspective, actually, they are preparing provenance research, and I share the view that the current endeavor of the provenance research. Next slide, please. By collaborating research from no, the previous one, provenance way forward. The way forward. No, it's okay. I share the view that the current endeavor of the provenance research by collaborating research from countries of origins can evolve into a fruitful and productive way of reaching a common understanding in the present and in the future. It has also taken a strong moral and political dimensions, as well as introduced a standard of due diligence. And provenance research for sure describes the social, cultural, and political history of the objects and of heritage formations. I actually second the argument that the provenance research is beyond the simple question of genesis, beyond repatriations or restitutions of cultural object issues, a symbol of national pride. Notwithstanding, as stated in the clues, provenance research is not an exact science and will therefore never produce objective and unambiguous results. Provenance research, as knowledge productions, is described as a joint intensive undertaking which is about significations, about relationship between people in the past, the present, and the future. It becomes a socio-political history and biography of cultural objects. That is what Director General Hilmar Farid aspires actually, as he in many occasions emphasized the importance of thorough provenance research with early and intensive involvement of Indonesian experts as a prerequisite for heritage and restitutions policy. In line with the aspiration of Dr. Hilmar Farid, this provenance research is not merely about the return of cultural objects, it is about knowledge productions. I think Dr. Ghani made a very good background on how the philosophy of this knowledge productions. It is about rewriting of histories. It is also about dealing with past injustice. And Pak Dirjen Farid firmly expressed his view that he is not interested in the repatriation of large number of objects. He interested in more in research as a joint undertaking with the ultimate goal of reaching common understanding. And also Farid affirms that it is important to start from something concrete that actually we at the committee is doing right now. Dear friends, it is also described that the debates about the restitution of cultural objects appropriated in the colonial situations are linked to a broader movement in recent decades aimed at restorative justice and transitional justice. The Netherlands echoes these sentiments as transpired in the report of Gonsalves Committee. It is important to note in the Gonsalves Committee that the crux of the recommendations made in this report was that the Netherlands must acknowledge that during the colonial period, many cultural objects came to the Netherlands against the will of their owner, and that the Netherlands must take responsibility for its colonial past by making recognitions and ratification of this injustice a key policy principles. The Netherlands, according to Gonsalves Committee, should express a readiness to return stolen colonial cultures objects unconditionally. This many times repeated when I met and talked 2 weeks ago with Lilian Gonsalves also. It is indeed heartening, dear friends, that the Dutch government, in response to the advice of Gonsalves Committee, expressed the wish to rectify historical injustice where possible, and if so requested, to return unconditionally both cultural objects involuntarily taken from a former Dutch colony and cultural objects of special significance to the country of origin. And it is also further reaffirmed that in line with the Dutch policy on colonial collections, the Netherlands is committed to return to Indonesia cultural objects that were taken against the will of Indonesians during the colonial period. So, what next, dear friends? As clearly indicated, the Netherlands agrees on the importance of research into these collections and desires to strengthen the cooperations between relevant institutions in the Netherlands and Indonesia. So, basically, I cannot agree more that the repatriation of objects is particularly valuable if it is accompanied by further cooperations and knowledge development about those objects. And it is not only the knowledge about objects and historical, religious or anthropological themes, as well as the collections, development history, and museum practices, but also knowledge of the networks necessary to conduct the research. If I may quote what Dr. Sri Magarna said, restitutions of colonial objects as part of the process of decolonizations must be accompanied by provenance research, which would not only trace the genesis of the object, but also importantly would give birth to new knowledge about those objects and their historical values, and should be the shared responsibility of both parties. And quoting Marika Bloomberg, she said that the objects can tell the socio-political stories that they hold within them, wherever and whomever, so that we can learn from the objects and see the understand the wider world beyond our own horizons and outside the context of heritage institution. So those are something that have been actually envisaged for some times before. As I said, and if you recall, the joint recommendation 1975 between the Dutch and Indonesian team of experts concerning cultural cooperations in the field of museum and archives, including transfer of objects, also clearly mentioned that the two delegations recognize that specific objects and specimens which are directly linked with persons of major historical and cultural importance or with crucial historical events in Indonesia should be transferred to the country of origins. And the two delegations also recognize the desirability to make cultural objects such as ethnographical and archival material available for exhibitions and study in the other country in order to fill the gaps in the already existing collections of cultural objects in both countries, to promote a mutual understanding and appreciations of each other's cultural heritage and history. The two delegations actually expressed the wish that a program of visual documentations be established in mutual cooperations to the direct benefit of museums of ethnology and archaeology in both countries. Next slide. So certainly, dear friends, colleagues, it takes two to tango. On the Indonesian part, the Minister of Education and Cultural Affairs in February last year, 2021, established a repatriation team consists of 9 experts from various fields. The team task actually involved to determine a working mechanism as a building blocks approach to provide information, advice, recommendations with regard to repatriation of Indonesian cultural objects from the Netherlands to Indonesia, and to involve experts from archaeology, anthropology, historian, epigraph, philology, and museology to identify the objects. If you may recall also that the interministerial meeting in July 2020 has set up standard operating procedures as guidelines for repatriations of cultural objects to Indonesia. For your information, time frames given for the repatriation team is until 2024. So basically, there is no luxury of time. So the team endeavors to build a momentum and mutual confidence within the government to government framework, set the tone and standard setting for a win-win solutions with standard of respects, and to determine domestic response, aspirations, and expectations. And from the focus group discussion we conducted in 2021, it is acknowledged that the expectation of the Indonesian community on these repatriations is very, very high actually. It covers a wide range of bucket lists, not only about the return of those cultural objects, but also a follow-up in the future, in particular on research collaborations, providing academic opportunities for the Indonesian experts to study in the Netherlands by scholarship, and how to deal with public communications. The discussion conducted had covered issues such as legality, good faith and moral responsibility, how to handle those domestically, process and procedures, financial support for the return, protocol and guarantee agreements, active involvement of the Indonesian experts, diplomacy, access for identifications, outreach program and dialogue, transparency, integrity, and how to avoid politicizations. And I'm concluding. So, at the present, at the recent discourse, the Indonesian and the Netherlands committee concluded and agreed to develop collaboratively and agreed upon a process that will facilitate the careful yet swift handling of Indonesian requests to for the return. So the next two slides actually are very, very important for your knowledge. So our priority is the lowest hanging fruits, actually based on the early gestures, the provenance research made by the Netherlands and whatever raised from Indonesia, and the previous pending issues from the 1975, also the non-provenance research. That includes the Balinese art heritage in 1940s on the Pitamaha collections. I should share also this with you, dear friends. In July 2022, 2 months ago, or 3 months ago rather, Dr. General Hilmar Farid presented a letter to the State Secretary of Culture and Media of the Netherlands requesting, officially actually, requesting 8 objects, but this is not limited and non-exhaustive, to be returned to Indonesia. This include the Pitamaha collections, reign of Prince Diponegoro's horse, of course, as Dr. Sisling said, the Dubois collections, including the Pithecanthropus skulls and femur, the Java man, Kris Puputan Klungkung, the Singasari statues. This includes Ganesha, Durga, Nandi Chawara, and Mbakala, and objects taken from the Lombok expedition 1894, Lu Regalia, and of course the Quran of Tekumar 1896. So we are fully understand this is not easy process, because the devil is in the details. The last slide, please. Because we are fully aware this, the devil is in the detail, include criteria, legal and protocol procedures, access for identifications, possible ramifications, etc. This is indeed a very complex, sensitive and extensive task. So my team now, as the last part of my presentations, is go back to the future. Because as Robert Darnton said, history is the undercurrent of the present that will not let itself be contained in the past. History is a continuous flow, pushing things onward and changing them. I think we agreed also that what the Dutch said, that decolonization should become history, and we have to stay true to our heritage, that what our brand is all about. So that's end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador Puja. Ya, Pak Puja menjelaskan sebenarnya secara umum repatriasi sejak negara kita berdiri itu selalu dibahas oleh para pendiri negara kita ya, dan sampai 49 kemudian terakhir 1975 itu selalu diusahakan gitu loh, selalu diusahakan. Dan dalam waktu dekat ini momentumnya saat ini ya Pak ya, karena di Eropa semangat untuk dekolonisasi dan repatriasi itu juga sedang gencar. Dan Direktorat Jenderal Kebudayaan telah meminta 8 setidaknya 8 begitu ya Pak ya, cultural object yang akan direpatriasi dalam waktu dekat. Dan ini tanggung jawab museum yang hadir di sini ya, Asosiasi Museum Indonesia, bagaimana menyambut kedatangan benda-benda repatriasi. Dan kebetulan pembicara terakhir kita Ibu Sadiah Bonstra, our last speaker, Dr. Sadia Bonstra, is a head of transition team BLU MCB.
I'm head of collections and curatorial at Team Transisi
Okay.
BLU MCB. Yeah. You want me to start? Is this working?
It's the sound is little, yeah, not so loud. Yeah, so
Is
the
this
floor,
better?
yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Here's my presentation. Okay, I hope good afternoon, everyone. As Papuji was already saying, I see that we're all struggling with our energy, and after lunchtime, that's always a challenge. I hope you still can find some energy to listen to my presentation before we can all take a break. So thank you so much for coming out today, and thank you, Ami, for having me as one of the speakers. And it's a pleasure and honor to be in the company of such distinguished speakers. As I was introduced, and as you can see here, I'm part of the transition team for BLU MCB, but I also have to say that I'm a researcher in the Pressing Matter project at VU University, as well as senior honorary fellow at Melbourne University. So I'm an historian and a curator, so I actually combine academic research with museum practice. So I've called my presentation Museums for a Change, because we do need a change, but the question is, how do we do this? We've heard many, all very interesting contributions about how museums can be decolonized, but what does it mean in practice, and how can we combine theory and practice in our work in the museum? So I would like, next slide please. As we are in Bandung, I would like to start here. I'd like to go back to 18th of April 1955, when 29 nations of Asia and Africa gathered for a week. Next slide. The Asia-Africa Conference was the first conference ever that was organized by and for people of color, and with the attendance of demographic giants China and India, the Bandung Conference actually represented more than 50% of the global population. So they created a global platform for those who wanted to have their voices heard, for the voices of the former colonized, the former oppressed, the former marginalized. Next slide. Okay. So from Belgrade to Tokyo, from Cairo to Dar es Salaam, politicians and intellectuals began to speak of the Bandung spirit. What they meant was actually pretty simple, that the colonized world had now emerged to claim its place in world affairs, and to not just be an adjunct to the first or even the second world, but as a player in world affairs. So the Bandung spirit was actually a refusal of both economic subordination and cultural suppression, two major policies of imperialism. Next slide. Oh, sorry, one back. Go back. So the London Conference was actually of epic significance. It was a world-shaping event that galvanized and radicalized a planetary spirit of decolonization and decoloniality. So its importance really cannot be underestimated. But today, the horizon has shifted. It has shifted from a desire to gain political independence of nation states to the wish to uncover coloniality and its working. In other words, we now want to understand how coloniality continues to negate, to disavow, to distort, and to deny knowledges, and then go beyond that. To keep it simple, we want to change the conversation. Next. So let's talk about coloniality and decoloniality. The term coloniality, we've heard it before earlier during Gani's presentation, was first introduced by Aníbal Quijano in the 1980s, and it is further developed by decolonial thinkers such as Rolando Vázquez, Walter Mignolo, and Maria Lugones. What coloniality does, it intends to reveal the hidden side of history, often the darker side of history. And it can be understood as a structural and systemic power dynamics that were put in place during colonialism and continue to sustain economic, social, class, racial, gender, cultural, and other inequalities. Decoloniality differs from decolonization in the sense that the aim of decolonization was to take hold of the state, but it left intact the political theory and the economy of colonialism. And this is what decoloniality addresses. Decoloniality offers a way out of thinking, being, knowing, understanding, but also a way out of living beyond the dominant frameworks of Europe and the North Atlantic. So what is interesting about coloniality and decoloniality is that it's not just a theory, it's not just an analytic, but it's also a praxis. We can all do it. It's about our attitude and about our mindset. We can all practice it. Next slide. So what decoloniality offers is that it unravels coloniality. It helps us to understand the working of coloniality, the systemic structures of inequality. Then decoloniality moves away from coloniality. It moves away from the systemic structures of inequality. And thirdly, it delinks and reconnects with what preceded the colonial enterprise and invasion. Next. So in the context of museums and also cultural heritage, a decolonial standpoint towards museums, collections, and cultural heritage means to look for and see the coloniality of museums. It means to look out for the unequal structures that museums actually have helped build. They have helped put in place these unequal structures that continue to permeate society today. So the global call to decolonize the museum is fueled by this shift to systemic and structural critique of the kind exemplified by decolonial and anti-racist paradigms. Decoloniality acknowledges the coloniality of the museum, and it uncovers the role of the museum in the creation of coloniality. So decoloniality is actually about understanding and revealing this darker side of the past to speak to the present and the future, as does Kung Fu Panda. So next, let me address the coloniality of museums a little bit further. So in the 1980s, political scientist Benedict Anderson, and I'm sure many of you know him, has already pointed to the connection between the museum and colonial nation building in a seminal study, Imagine Communities. So in this book, he argues that the museum, together with the census and the map, were the three tools that the colonial state used to draw the contours of its domain and the geography of its colonized lands, the nature of the people it ruled, and the history of its power. As Ajeng already mentioned, it was a tool for colonial nation building. Next, the map made the colony visible. Next, the map made the colony visible. The census made the colony imaginable because it gave insight in the number of people that was actually living in the colonized lands. The museum arranged the knowledge that was collected and showcased its people, products, and objects in the museum. This map is still on show in Museum Nasional Indonesia in Jakarta. Collecting and exhibiting objects in public museums made the colonial world imaginable to wider publics. These three tools, the map, the census, and the museum, together made the colony specific and comprehensible. Next, showcasing objects was not something new. It was already being done in the 17th centuries when the princes of Europe had private cabinets to show their curiosities to their friends. But in the following century, overseas objects increasingly became a source of information about the worlds they stemmed from. And by the 19th century, ethnographic museums contributed to colonial knowledge building and sometimes directly to the geographical expansion of the colony. Museums made such collections accessible to an increasingly larger public. More and more people came to see the objects in the museums. The development of the museum happened alongside the emergence of the university as a knowledge system. So the museum and the university together became major institutions that facilitated the development of new sets of knowledges, such as geology, biology, archaeology, anthropology, but also history and art history. These knowledges didn't exist. They were created by the university and the museum together. Next, crucial for each of these new disciplines was the selection and ordering of objects and ultimately also people, colonized people, in evolutionary sequences to map human reality and history. Generally, the knowledge building and the separation of Europe from other people and other worlds through the process of othering resulted from a Eurocentric worldview and colonialism. This specific form is what Quijano calls coloniality, a specific colonial structure of power that produced specific social discriminations that were later categorized as racial, ethnic, and anthropological. And even though political colonialism has ended, we now live in an independent state, coloniality continues to exist globally. Next. Next, please. Yeah. So the museum, as an institution, is a European intervention. It's a European invention that is rooted in a Eurocentric worldview that created historical, cultural, and racialized hierarchies and made them visible and accessible to the audience, to the world. These power dynamics are coloniality. Next. So, what do we do if we have this power that can make or break coloniality? What do we choose to do? And what can we do in practice? Next slide. So if the museum holds this power, as I just explained, we are in the business of knowledge creation and knowledge production. And in order to decolonize the museum, we have to change the way in which we think about knowledge. This is very much aligned with what Dr. Ghani was explaining earlier. Decolonizing knowledge is decolonial. It's doing something decolonial. And it is about reconnecting and relinking with knowledge that was already here, that preceded the colonial enterprise. So for the Indonesian context, that would mean to reconnect and highlight and prioritize local indigenous knowledge, kearifan lokal. This will change how we think about our knowledge, what we value about knowledge, and how we produce knowledge. This will not just change the content, it will really change the conversation. For instance, when Rumphius in the 17th century wrote his famous Herbarium Amboinense, he relied on mostly local women to share their plant knowledge with him. He then wrote it down, framed the plants and knowledge according to the Latin system as set up by Linnaeus. He basically whitewashed local knowledge and subsequently published his work, for which he would be widely acclaimed. However, the local women and men who actually helped him, who shared their knowledge with Rumphius, were rendered silent. They remained invisible and silent for the rest of the world. In this slide, we see a 2-channel video work by the Artist Collective Life Batch from Yogyakarta. And they are very much working on epistemic violence. So the erasure of knowledge, erasure of local knowledge. And they highlight in this video the violence against local knowledge that has to do with jamu making. The making of medicinal herbal drinks that we still use here in Indonesia and have been using for centuries. So in order to decolonize the museum, we need to do this too. We need to revalue indigenous knowledge and praxis across the archipelago to develop new models of knowledge, to develop new ways to confront and look at our collections, to get a new understanding of the objects in our collections. We should focus on the communal, but also on knowledge embedded in life and in all of its aspects, rituals, songs, dance, intangible heritage, as we call it now. This will change the conversation, not just the content. Next one. So to be a bit more concretely, what can we do in the museum? Next slide. First, as I already said, we need to be fully aware and confront and challenge the coloniality of our institutions and collections. This is actually the fundamental task of decoloniality. We cannot decolonize if we do not question our very foundation. We need to stop reflecting colonial ideas. We need to stop continuing colonial ideas, but to really critically approach our colonial sources, which means our collections in the museums. That means that we need to listen to silences in the collections and need to ask, what has been made invisible in our collections? What has been made irrelevant as a result of coloniality? What kind of culture did not end up in our collections because the colonizers just weren't interested? Rather than reauthorizing the work of colonial scholars who brought together our collections, we need to take a profound decolonial approach. We need to resist and rewrite colonial vocabularies. Secondly, I agree with Dr. Ghani. We need to decolonize our knowledge. One back. We need to look at our collections, history and culture from before the colonial project started. We need to prioritize the indigenous genealogies and trajectories of life that cannot be traced back to the claimed Greco-Latin heritage of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance as in Europe. We need to see history from our own indigenous and local frameworks that exist outside the framework of the dominant West. This will create space for diversity, but diversity in a non-essentialist way, which only compartmentalizes culture. So part of decolonizing our knowledge can be achieved through object repatriation, as Pa Puja just spoke about. While in some cases, the physical return of an object is really important, it is not just about that, because issues of repatriation and access to colonial collections in Europe and elsewhere is in my view, about retrieving cultural memory. It is about filling the gaps that were left behind when the object was removed from its original context. It is about retrieving that knowledge, retrieving the cultural memory that was lost. But we also need to connect this knowledge to the present and to the future. The knowledge that was there before the colonial enterprise is still embedded in the objects in the collections. So it's still part of the present. History is always part of the present and therefore also to the future. thirdly, I think we need to relink with the demographic genealogies that preceded the colonial project too. So that means, in honor of the legacy of the Bandung spirit, we should recover connections and networks of knowledge and exchange that existed before the colonial enterprise. Here in Indonesia, a well-known example of such a project is the Jalur Rempah project of the Ministry of Education and Culture that looks into Jalur Rempah before the colonial period and has uncovered traces of exchange between Sumatra, China, and India, for example. But there are so many other and so many more connections that we could make and that could be explored. We could also focus, for example, on the networks that existed around the Indian Ocean, up until Madagascar, as well as later connections with indigenous North Australia. So many connections that remain underexplored and that we can still strengthen for the future. So to move away from the dominant framework of knowledge exchange, we should really consider and reconsider the South-South connections and rebuild these relationships. So in other words, let's keep the Bandung spirit alive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bonstra. I note some I note some ideas from Dr. Bonstra ya, bahwa I will speak in bahasa, bahwa dekolonisasi itu adalah praksis ya, bukan hanya bukan di awang-awang gitu, tapi dia juga harus bisa diterjemahkan dalam praktik di lapangannya seperti apa gitu. Dan repatriasi itu memang penting karena bisa mengisi fill the gap atau retrieving the memory. Tapi yang lebih penting adalah bagaimana dekolonisasinya gitu loh. Fasilitas mungkin untuk mempersiapkan kembalinya benda-benda repatriasi itu mungkin penting, tapi yang perlu lebih dipersiapkan adalah mindset paradigmanya dalam melihat koleksi, karena dekolonisasi itu yang lebih penting adalah decolonization the knowledge gitu ya, bukan sekedar bendanya datang, tapi kita juga harus bisa melihat benda itu dari sudut yang lebih jernih dan yang lebih baik. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, so I think I want to open a question session for attendees here in Bandung, and also maybe in Zoom. Okay. First one, we can no other microphone, so you have to speak. You have to come from. Please commently give the microphone. Okay. Please introduce yourself and.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. You have explained the excellent. And my question is, the first one, maybe I have 3 questions. The first one is for Mr. Ghani. Maybe, as we know that before we can talk more about decolonialism, we need to look at how it was colonized. And Indonesia is where I was born and raised. Ever since the age of the colonialism ended, Indonesia has been working hard to modernize its economies and catch up with rest of the world either. And from history and the past, we've learned a lot. And so, do you think all the problem that Indonesia is facing nowadays come from colonialism and imperialism. That's the point. And the second one maybe for Miss Ajeng. As we know, the Japanese in Indonesia called as occupation, not colonialism. As you said before, Japanese era seems forgotten, right? And it is hard for us in historical field, and me especially in Museum Gedung Sate, to collect the data in terms of the short that time, the occupation. And maybe you can give the advice for me especially how to collect primary sources and yeah, more effectively. And for Mr. Puja and Miss Saida, maybe, despite of the strengthening between Netherlands and Indonesia, not only Indonesia who requests the object, but also the Netherlands, should Indonesia urge the Netherlands to repatriate the collections? And should the Netherlands governor renew the rule of law like United Kingdom has done about decision and repatriate object in the past? Thank you. And before that, I'm Rian Valdani Ahmad Hidayat from Museum Gedung Sate. I'm representing also the governor of West Java. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rian. Yeah. Before you can answer, I got a question also from the Zoom. My name is Gil Ramadan, alumni, someone who graduated. He studied his undergraduate thesis. He wrote his undergraduate thesis about Indonesian repatriation case. I can say it was hard. It was so hard to find Indonesian archives about repatriation. That was written by Indonesian government, especially the archives dated back in the 70s. But I'm so happy with these seminars. So I want to ask to Miss Araini Kasih and Dr. Jailani, what is the main challenge on researching about repatriation? Does the politics matter that much, and we should be aware of it? To Dr. Sisling, do you think the natural collection that was brought from Indonesia should be repatriated, and what is your biggest concern about that? To Ambassador Puja and to Dr. Bonstra, do you think the objects that were repatriated should be restored in the provincial museum where the object was origin, or just in national museum? I am also curious about the second one because I have asked Mr. Dr. Jailani, where we put Luwu regalia. Should we put it in Luwu, or in Makassar, or in Jakarta? That is, to what extent the colonization process is happening. That's all. Maybe who? Puja.
Okay. Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Rian. First, for the question about the colonial production, knowledge production, that's I believe that by doing that kind of research, we can see how the knowledge was formed in the colonial period, and especially how, to what extent this knowledge is still in existence and used, for example, to keep inequality in our daily life. For the second question about the progress, is it Indonesia, thanks to the colonialism, that we are in our state now? But I must say that for some people, of course, Indonesia is in the progress. But if we don't change our way of our term of conversation, our progress is always seen from the Europe. Yes, we are in the progress, but our progress is always one step behind the Europe. We are not. We will not be able to catch the Europe or the Western countries if you don't change the term of conversation, because everything, as Dipesh Chakrabarti said, if you see always the history from a teleological framework, which start from Europe, and outside Europe is always one step behind. I think we are always one step behind. That's for this reason. I think that's why I propose in my presentation, and also Dr. Sadia Bonsra as well. I think we need to change structure of our knowledge, structure of our understanding, and our term of conversation. And for the second question from Gilang, how do we carry out our research on archive for the repatriation? I must say, actually, I'm not an expert in post-colonial Indonesia. I'm not quite familiar with the archive after independent Indonesia, because I'm most likely a historian of 19th century. So I must say, I don't know much about the archive about post-Indonesian, post-colonial Indonesia. Thank you.
Mr. Rian, is there any follow-up question? No, thank you. Okay, so Miss Ajeng.
Okay, thank you for, is this sounds okay? Okay. Thank you for the questions. For my own research, because it's about museums, so I got archive from the Museum Sono Budoyo and the Batavia's Genootschap, the National Museum, in the National Archive. But generally about the Japanese occupations, to understand how the development of the museums, I read the newspapers of the Japanese era. There are Asia Raya, Cahaya, Suara Asia, Jawa Baru, Jawa Baru is magazine, Panji Pustaka is also magazine, and some other, maybe one or two others. From the beginning, from 1942 to 1945, so scrolling it every days to find the word museums. So I understand what's going on in the museums. But for you, it is hard work actually, and that's available in the National Library in a microfilm. So you ask the librarian to give you with the newspapers. And maybe if you're looking for Bandung, it's probably Cahaya is the best, because it's in Bandung. The editor is Otto Iskandarinata, I think. So maybe you can read the Cahaya newspaper to understand what happens in Bandung during the Japanese occupation. I don't know whether there will be something about the Gedung Sate or not, but who knows? I think that's my answer. And for Gilang's questions in the Zoom, I'm sorry, I'm not dealing with repatriations. So maybe Sadia could answer it later. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, maybe then I just follow immediately up on the research question about repatriation. So that was not really part of my talk today, but I also work on researching the history of the discourse of repatriation in Indonesia, because so far, up until now, most of the research has been done from a Dutch perspective, because the archives in the Netherlands are a little bit easier to access than here in Indonesia. So that is, I think, most of the reason why that research has been taking place from that perspective. But of course, it's also for us. It's really important and to understand also what were the discussions here, what were the discourses here. So since things are not always as easy, I think it just means we kind of like have to work harder to get the information that we need and that we want. And obviously, it's not always possible. Like I've been doing the research on the discussions on object repatriation in 1949 as part of the Roundtable Conference negotiations in The Hague at the time. So if you actually do look, you will find something. But it's of course, but that's also historical research. It's never what you are hoping for or what you actually need, but it will tell you something. And for the things that we don't know or the silences in the archives, we have to address that too. We have to think, why can I not find the information that I'm looking for, and to also reflect on that. Like, why is the information not here? Is it just because of the situation, or is it because the archives were maybe moved from here to there or taken by the Dutch and taken away to the Netherlands? So, and if we don't have that information, and this is because I think the question was from someone who was doing research about the 1970s, like Ajahn was doing. Like, there are the newspapers, there are the magazines, there are all the media outlets that were already existing. What do they say about this particular topic? There might still be people alive who were there in the 70s, who have heard or who were involved in these negotiations as well. So it's kind of like you have to be really, really creative as a historian, like not only rely on the archive, it's only one of our sources, but media is a source, it's also oral history is also really a source. So there are also images, like we need to just use all of the sources that we can find. Papuja?
Well, I'm a bit tired of sitting for 2 hours. If you allow me, just standing for a while. Well, regarding the first questions, you said we should urge the Netherlands to do this, but I don't think that we need to urge it, because repatriation is something. It's not out of the blue suddenly, you know. As we made the presentation, it started from the 1949 and Muhammad Yamin, 1975. The latest one is the Chris Diponegoro. Well, this is a complex and long process indeed. Not something that, like your neighbor borrow your knife and then the next day you ask the knife to be returned back. This is not something like this, you know, because it needs legal processes or something like this. But you also ask whether the Netherlands should create a new law, something like this. But from my discussion with them, this is unlike the Belgium actually, who actually created a generic law on this particular repatriation. But I don't think the Netherlands need to make a new law, because they have already guidelines on how to return those objects to the origins country. Certainly, from my own experience when dealing with the return of Chris Diponegoro, it took almost 3 years to have this, really, the Chris Diponegoro back to Indonesia and then return to the Museum National, because probably the process, legal process, is quite complicated actually, because this is not only creating or preparing provenance research whatsoever, but also how the political process should be included by asking the permission from the parliament. Without permission from the parliament, those objects cannot be returned, because those objects is categorized as state-owned objects. This non-state-owned object probably a bit easier, but on as long as the state-owned object is concerned, to be returned is a bit more complicated. This will include not only the parliament but also public, because one day before the government to decide the state-owned objects, this should be announced in the Stadblad or in the newspaper. This object should be or will be returned to particular country. If there is an objection from one individual country, so the government should rethink about this. As long as there is no objection from the public, so then the process a bit smoother. So this is the complications of the. This is not just like membalikkan tangan, telapak tangan. So very, very complicated. I experienced myself back to 4 years ago in the Netherlands how to return those objects. And about the knowledge what is called knowledge repatriation. Not only the stuff or the object to be repatriated, but knowledge repatriation and knowledge production. I give you an example about the return of Prajna Paramita. You know, right? The Prajna Paramita, the statue, based on the negotiation between the two teams, Indonesian team and the Netherlands team in 1975. But only this Prajna Paramita was returned 3 years later in 1978. So it took 3 years. But what about the knowledge of Prajna Paramita? This is not about the return of the statue. But do you know who is Prajna Paramita? Who you know that? Because a lot of different perceptions about Prajna Paramita. Because some say that Prajna Paramita is like Candedes, the statue of Candedes. But it was not the statue of Candedes, but it is the statue of actually one of the most powerful women in Java. This is Gayatri Rajapatni, the wife of Raden Wijaya, the builder of Majapahit. So I think she was the fourth wife from the four family daughters actually. Prajna Paramita is the most powerful woman in the history of Java, because she found Gajah Mada and she made the rulings on. That's why you know this perang bubat between Sunda and Java that time. So a lot of story about Prajna Paramita, about Gayatri Rajapani. That's something, that knowledge that we have to know. You know, this is not about the statue. This is not about Prajna Paramita is located in the National Museum right now. But that's a lot of things that I think the provenance research actually now is being prepared thanks to the Dutch expert actually. So we learned a lot from this provenance research. You can probably read some of them, and also on the
Ambassador
objects.
Puja.
Yes.
Sorry, you may shorten your.
Yeah.
answer.
I'm
Sorry.
short already enough actually, so compared to the Dutch, are very tall. So, well, one thing, questions actually very, very important. How you can find those processes of repatriations. This is also told by Ibu Saidia, but if you read this report, is called Clues. It has been now translated in Bahasa Indonesia. This is all about 65 objects, 165 or 65 objects? 65 objects, mostly from Indonesia and some from Sri Lanka. This all the history about the repatriation. But you can read it, click it, probably the Clues. The title is Clues, and this is the history how from the beginning the repatriation process to Indonesia was developed. And the last one actually also your queries, but where then the objects will be returned, whether in the national museums or in the local regional museums. But we have the interministerial processes, Pak, interkementerian. So they have the what is called the standard operating procedures. So they will make a decision where to be sent those objects. It's not us, not the team for sure, but we have to be careful on this, because I share you something very interesting when we talk about the return or the possible return of Berlian Banjarmasin, the diamond, Banjarmasin diamonds. So how to deal with this? So a lot of claims already from the family, from the Sultan of Banjarmasin. So they said that's belong to my family. And then when we ask them, so what are you going to do with those diamond? And they said, oh, we will crack it and we distribute it to our family, and we sold them, we got money, we rich, that's all. So that's what we want? Of course not. So something needed to deal with this very, very carefully. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you. From Dr. Bronstra, do you have any? No, cukup. Okay, so we got one attendee from Zoom, Mr. Eko Sebastian. Oh, sorry. Before that, Dr. Sisling, are you still there? One question for Dr. Sisling. How we switch? Okay, sorry, Dr. Sisling has left the room. Okay, so yang Eko Sebastian, can we reach to him? How? Lagi chat. Okay, before okay, Eko Bastiawan. Yeah, you may speak. Start.
Okay, can everyone hear my voice? Yes. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a lot for the opportunity. Very splendid presentations from each of the speakers. I learned a lot today. I would like to give questions, but before that, I want to give a comment. A short comment. Mr. Puja, you mentioned earlier that the case of the repatriations in Cambodia, I don't think that could be fully compared to Indonesia, because as we know that the majority of Cambodians are either Buddhist or Hindu. So basically bringing back those ancient sculptures from UK, from America, from Australia is actually bringing back their deities, bringing back their gods or goddesses. And I don't think the sense, the urgency is the same here, because we know that the majority of Indonesians are non-Muslims. But that does not obviously decrease the spirit of bringing all the objects back to Indonesia. You mentioned about the importance of provenance a couple of times, and then in the case of the Singosari sculpture, which becomes among the priorities of the sculptures to be brought back to Indonesia, we know exactly where these sculptures are located. We even have the Sela, the temple is still there, and we do have the new built museums. Speaking for someone who actually live quite close from Singosari museums, we have new museums in Singosari, and sadly, what is inside is actually only the replica of the sculptures which are now in the Volkenkundian museums. So my question is basically the same. Once we manage to bring all the sculpture back to Indonesia, do you think that those sculptures from Singosari could be put on the original site in Malang, in Singosari? That's the first question. The second question is, above all, with the spirit of bringing back the objects from the museums in the Netherlands in particular, the question is, are we ready to receive these objects? Do we have the human resources to take care of these objects? I don't want to compare the treatments, but it is very obvious. Museums in the Netherlands, I would say, has a better technology, maybe human resources in taking care of the objects. So that's also becomes the concern, that's also become the things that from the Indonesian part need to think about before obviously receiving those objects coming back to Indonesia. I think that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the first question has already answered, yeah, Mr. Eko, about placing in the original place, yeah. And the second one maybe about our readiness to accept the repatriation artifacts. Maybe it's also can be answered by Dr. Bonstra.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very pertinent questions in it. When you talk about Cambodia, but of course I'm not comparing Cambodia and Indonesia. It's not like an apple to apple, of course. Because why I am mentioning Cambodia, this only just gained the momentum. Only recent momentum. It's only early this month, October, they went to United Kingdom. That's why I took it as a momentum that we need to gear up this process. Of course, I assume that you've never been to Leiden, because the statue Singosaris in Leiden World Museum, Volkerkunde Museum, so many of them over there. You will be amazed, if you visit Leiden Museum once. It's a huge and beautiful statues from Singosari. That's actually one of the 8 items that we wish to request to be returned from the Netherlands. Your last questions: are we ready? Yes, certainly we are ready, more than ready. That's why we make a priority. We do not ask hundreds of thousands of items to be returned to Indonesia, but we make a priority. That's why in July, Pak Dirjen Farid wrote a letter only requesting 8 items, 8 objects, not hundreds of thousands of objects, but 8 objects. But this is not exhaustive, not limited. And we learn also from the Dutch delegation that they are welcoming if there are more requests from Indonesia. So because they need to prepare the provenance research if there are more new requests from Indonesia. So they need to make a provenance research before giving back to Indonesia. This is the process. That's why from the very beginning I categorize those objects as the lowest hanging fruits. That's what we consider or realistically this to be returned in the near future? Because this is not something new. As I said, so many objects were returned before, starting from 1950s, 1970s, etc. And the last one was the Keris di Ponorogo. Bu Sarah?
Thank you, Pa. Maybe just to follow up a little bit on this argument of collection management and are the museums in Indonesia equipped to take care of whatever comes back? That is a very well-known argument that does not only live here but is also very often raised in the Netherlands or in any other European country that is actually reluctant about repatriating objects. So to me, I feel as a curator and someone now in charge of the collection management and curatorial, I think, well, there's no choice. In the case of object return, we have to be ready. And in some cases, we are ready, and we have to make sure that the objects are coming back in an environment where we can take care of them and we can give them a new life. Because that's basically what it is about, right? These objects have had a life before they were taken from their original contacts to the Netherlands and are now coming back, or hopefully coming back. We're giving them a new life, so it's also our responsibility to make sure that we can give them a life that that is how do you say that, suitable for those objects, but also in the context of what we can offer and what Indonesia is today.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have run out of time. So I will have some summary about what we have discussed in this afternoon. Museum has a responsibility, either in Indonesia or in Europe, to posit artifacts and present it to the public, and it is unspared entity to colonialization. Therefore, to decolonialize our knowledge and history, we should decolonialize our museum. And one program that entails decolonization in the museum is repatriation. Let's assume that our friends in the Netherlands, museum in the Netherlands, are ready to repatriate some artifacts from Indonesia that was collected years ago from the colonial times. But the main question for AMI, Asosiasi Museum Indonesia, who brought up this topic in this event, are we ready? Regarding the facility, it is maybe the easiest part. We just have to build new facility, create new facility, buy new equipment. But do we have a decolonialized mindset to see the objects in a new way? Do we have a paradigm that is more reflected today's society, like in social injustice, promote social injustice? Do we have that capacity to do that research? And I think it is more important that is more important question, that are more important question to be asked. And before we close our discussion, Bu Dahlia, is there any? I was told that you want to give some closing statement. No. Okay. So this event is dedicated to Mr. Desmond Satria Andrian, a curator, educator from Museum Konferensi Asia Afrika, who was dedicated in advancing museum in Indonesia. So, is there any MC left? No. If there is no MC, so okay. Okay, so to dedicate Mr. Desmond, we will play a video here. Okay. So we will close our event by photo, group photo. Maybe there is one committee that will coordinate the photo session. Okay. Oh. Okay. So by that we close our discussion. I am personally learn a lot about decolonization, repatriation, and museum in general. And then I will give it to the okay. By this, the discussion is closed. Thank you.
Baik, selamat sore kepada hadirin sekalian yang telah hadir pada malam hari ini. Mungkin bisa untuk sekali lagi tepuk tangan semeriah-meriahnya untuk hari ini. Sangat luar biasa speaker kita pada sore hari ini, pembahasan yang sangat luar biasa. Mungkin sebelumnya untuk pembicara, the beloved speakers, bisa untuk foto terlebih dahulu untuk di depan layar. Madap ke depan aja dulu Pak. Iya, memadap untuk kehadirin, untuk foto bersama, untuk speakersnya juga diundang kepada Bapak Yok, Ibu Dahlia untuk ikut hadir ke atas panggung untuk dapat foto bersama. Untuk hadirin jangan kemana-mana terlebih dahulu karena setelah ini kita akan foto bersama kembali. Oke, untuk mungkin teman-teman dari panitia bisa dapat mempersiapkan Baik, apakah sudah sesuai teman-teman panitia atau mungkin harus digeser sedikit? Pak Yok, mungkin mohon maaf, mohon izin untuk agak geser sedikit untuk dapat center di tengah. Baik. Mari kita mulai. 1, 2, 3. Baik, sekali lagi mungkin dengan salam museum. Baik, salam museum, museum di hatiku. Baik, apa cukup teman-teman panitia? Baik, mungkin untuk lebih hangat lagi mungkin ya Pak di sore hari ini, Ibu mohon izin untuk teman-teman hadirin untuk dapat hadir di depan panggung untuk dapat foto bersama-sama. Mungkin untuk dibantu untuk teman-teman panitia untuk dapat mengatur kursinya agar speaker dapat tetap di depan dan teman-teman hadirin yang berbahagia dapat di belakang. Baik, sekali lagi kami turut mengundang untuk speakers, the beloved speakers, Bapak dan Ibu jajaran untuk Hari Museum Indonesia 2022 untuk dapat duduk dan teman-teman hadirin yang berbahagia dapat hadir di belakang speakers tersebut. Untuk teman-teman fotografer, apakah sudah center? Baik, terima kasih kepada hadirin yang berbahagia yang telah hadir dan juga beloved speaker dan juga pejabat dari museum, ketua museum dari Asosiasi Museum Indonesia, Asosiasi Museum DKI Jakarta dan juga teman-teman yang berbahagia pada hari ini. Sangat amat luar biasa, semoga kita dapat bertemu di acara selanjutnya. Selamat Hari Museum Indonesia 2022. Salam sahabat museum, museum di hatiku. Terima kasih, saya Karina Aulia dari Duta Museum DKI Jakarta.